he is a writer and as well as a technical writer. So, Misak, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Hi everyone. Thank you for having me on your show. And yes, so I started off my career after college as a technical writer. I hail from the East Coast, and uh, one of the things that my parents were very afraid of when I switched my major from business, which is what every good Armenian young man does, or either medicine, law, or business are the three acceptable majors. And so, much to their dismay, I switched to English literature, thinking, oh, you know what, I want to be an artist when I grow up, which is the worst thing that you can never tell your parents. But I proved them wrong. Straight out of college, I was able to get a decent job as a technical writer in the defense contracting industry, which is what you do when you live in Washington, D.C. or around that area. And essentially what a technical writer does, for anyone who doesn't know what it is, it's just to use a very basic example. When you buy a toaster, there's an instruction manual that comes inside the box. A technical writer will usually write that instruction manual. Now, granted, with me, I was writing much more complex software documentation, and I was doing like a lot of help topics for call center people and the like. So that was something that, it was really great to hone my skills as a writer. And it was a great way for me to pay the student loans as well, which were quite considerable.
And I imagine it gave you training in clarity and absolutely getting to the point. And also, I think the really good technical writers, and I suspect that you are one, you look at it from the point of view of the consumer, of the user. How can I write this in the simplest and most clear way for someone to follow a direction or understand something?
Absolutely. The target audience is something that is very central to what a technical writer needs to focus on in order to be successful in their career. And how this relates, I think, to the artistic side of me as well, because technical writing is quite dry and it's not something that really has a lot of creative license. You don't have that, liberty. But what's great about it, the connection there is that in screenwriting, for example, what you have to do is be very economical with the words that you use. So it's not really the words that you use, but the space around those words are also central to how you convey images and dialogue, right? So with technical writing, it's kind of the same deal where if you have like one block of paragraph that you're trying to convey a simple idea, your readers are going to lose interest. They're going to get lost inside the blackness, right? And so in technical writing, what you learn very early on is you have to use bullets and numbers and, and you have to space them in a way and use very short sentences. And so what's useful about that is that you have to convey the most amount of information in like the least amount of text, if that makes sense.
It's interesting. Did you have any training, or did just they throw you onto a project?
You know what? I got thrown into the deep end here. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It was just more along the lines of I had an agent, in one of those temp agencies. I had submitted my resume, and I essentially got the job.
And you learned on the job.
I learned on the job.
Well, I'm curious. What were some of your first assignments?
Good question. Let me think. I had to essentially work with a lot of the programmers and engineers and kind of understand what they were creating, which is the number one thing that you have to do. As a technical writer, it's all about communicating with people, right? So it's a very social kind of job. So I found myself talking to people that I had never talked to and about things that I didn't know existed, and so I finally understood, HTML and CSS and how they kind of worked in order to create web development stuff. And the whole reason I needed to learn about this was because I had to explain to our call center employees that the software that we're creating, it has this design for this reason, blah blah blah. I don't know.
So in a sense, you had to pretend to be the user in a way. In other words, you had to understand it fully to be able to. In other words, they say that one of the best ways to learn something is to teach it to somebody else.
That's exactly
so
true.
Once probably when you had written your final draft, you really, really, really knew your subject, and I write and Dan writes, and so we know about writing that when you're writing something, you will pull out of your head some experience you had at a job or in life, or some piece of knowledge that you have. So all of this is fodder for your creativity. Is that? I'm sensing that might be true.
It's true in the sense that you are working with what are known as subject matter experts, right? And what's really interesting about that is that they come from a very completely different world. They come from a very technical world, and they're not the best communicators. Sometimes they are, and those are the most easy people to work with because you can always be on the same page with them, and they're just as clear as you would hope anyone would be.
Right.
But a great majority of them are not. They are not.
No,
communicators.
engineers are not. I've worked with engineers. They're not the greatest communicators.
I remember in the early days of the computer and in software that the documentation that would come with the software was so complicated that nobody could ever follow it, which is why those Microsoft Word for Dummies, then those books came out. And do you find that any interest in writing that type of book in the future?
To be honest with you, I did technical writing for 5 years, and they were a great 5 years. I learned a lot. I was able to move out of the house, about 2 years ago because of my technical writing career. So I owe a lot to technical writing, but I feel like that's also a career that I'm grateful for, but it's in my past now. So I'm working on other projects. I'm trying to pursue my creative ambitions the best way I can, and I will maybe have to turn back to technical writing if things don't go as they're planned. But right now I'm young enough and I'm single. I don't have kids. So that gives me the liberty to be a little bit more experimental now and pursue more riskier kind of avenues to make money.
Let's go back to you lived in Virginia, outside of Washington, correct? What town did you live in?
I grew up in a town called Stafford, but then I moved to another place called Chantilly for a while, which is about 30 minutes outside of Washington, D.C.
And what was that like? Is there an Armenian community there?
Good question. Well, first, just to preface, I don't know if anyone knows or can tell by my name, I am Armenian. And so I grew up in a part of town, especially when I was living and growing up in Stafford, where I was probably I was the only Armenian outside of my family within at least a 30-mile radius, if not.
So your parents chose to live in an area. What was it for your father's work?
Where
there were where you were the only Armenian family.
Exactly.
Because we are used to Glendale, which has, as most people know, a very large Armenian population. What did your father do? What does he do?
He is a software engineer. So he worked in an industry. He was very successful because when he came to America, he was, I think, very young, like 18 years old. And he essentially was very lucky because it was during the 80s and there was the computer boom. And so he took like 2 classes at Germanic Community College and on computers. And then he got a job right out the gate, and he was making a lot of money for someone who, is an immigrant essentially. And so it was because he was very smart and logical.
Right.
And so he was able to find a nice career as a software engineer, and that's pretty much what he did. He moved on up in companies and things like that.
So what was it like growing up? Did you feel, I imagine you had friends and a social life and you went to school. Was there any kind of a deal made about your being Armenian, or?
Well, as you know, my name is Misag, and the way it's spelled is M-I-S-S-A-K. And as you can imagine...
Oh, Miss, yes.
Yeah,
Kids are mean.
I would always resent the roll calls in the mornings. I would be afraid of them because every morning I would go to school and I knew, especially when substitute teachers would come into the mix and they don't know me. I remember very clearly there was this one time, I think it was 3rd or 4th grade, one of the substitute teachers kind of winced. And since my last name is Artinian, it's an A, so I'm usually the first one on the line. So she's kind of wincing at this piece of paper, and I'm like, oh God, I don't know what to do. Do I just volunteer and just be like, yeah, it's Misag, okay? But no, I never do. I'm in the back, just kind of waiting for the damage. And so she said, is it Missy? Is it Missy? And and I was like, oh God, why?
Yeah.
Why, Mom and Dad?
Really?
Yeah. And so that was one of the ways that I was kind of different from other kids. So there's the name, and also I didn't really look like other kids because I was in a very white neighborhood. So I was kind of, it's odd to say because I consider myself very white, especially here in California. But in Virginia, I'm the brownest person there.
Did you have friends? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, because I grew up in Virginia too, but it was 30 years earlier, and it's interesting because I was in my elementary school. I was the only Asian, and in junior high there were 2 of us. There was Mike, Kim, and me, and that was it. But we didn't really have the racism problem in D.C., and we were Fairfax County. See, Misak is from the rich side of the street. We were not. So he was kind of on the twee side, so you'd figure that they would be a lot more accepting and all of that. But yeah, I got the usual jokes about the name and the mispronunciation and all of that.
Right.
Well, I grew up in a town of 100,000, Fall River, Massachusetts, where there was a very strong Jewish community. There were 5,000 Jews, and I only encountered anti-Semitism once in high school. I was called a name by someone, and I yelled something back, and then we later became friends, actually. But so all the three of us are kind of like from a minority. But what was it like? Did you enjoy growing up there? Did you have a lot of friends? Your extracurricular? What led you to your creativity?
You know what? I'll be honest with you. I felt pretty silent. I was not a happy child, I don't think. Like, of course, when I would go home, I would play video games a lot, and I would keep to myself for the most part. I think I was raised more by the television and internet than really my parents, to be honest. And so, yeah, and then once I would go to school, I was a little socially awkward. I didn't really connect to people very well. And I think part of it was just this self-conscious part of myself where I felt like I was different. I felt like I was an outsider in many respects. And I think that's really where artists and creative people kind of come from. This idea of, you don't feel like you belong to any community. Like, you go home and you don't feel like you belong. You go to school and you don't feel like you belong. And really the only outlet that you have is just kind of being in your own kind of imagination. And so I remember very clearly as a kid, I would be in the basement and I would just role play on my own. Just like, I used to love like Power Rangers and like all these other things. So I would always pretend that I was, the Green Ranger, and like, I would get the Pink Ranger, and like we would have a romance. And it was just like this kind of
You had
like
your
fantasy
imagination
world.
kept you busy. Where'd you go to college?
I went to this small liberal arts school that was not too far from my hometown, which is called University of Mary Washington. And I really enjoyed my education there. They had a really good writing program. Actually, one of my favorite professors that I had over there, his name was Dr. Steve Watkins, and I took a creative writing workshop with him. And that was, I think, the first time that I ever really had the confidence to write and be very personal with my writing, to the point where, not even knowing so, he pointed out to me that I was reminiscent of an Armenian Philip Roth. And I didn't know who Philip Roth was. Yeah, but like, a lot of my stories actually were very revealing kind of stories about a young man who was Armenian and would have like a frustrating life in his relationships and his friendships and things like that.
I know both Dan and I, and I think Dan will agree with you, you're a very fine writer, and that you plumb the depths of your psyche when you write. You also have written essays, very humorous essays. Tell us a little bit about some of the essays that you've written and the feedback that you've gotten.
Yeah, I guess the one that went viral, it was for this blog that we started called 99 and Counting. It was something that my good friend Taline and her brother John had kind of started. And they reached out to me because I had met John on the East Coast, but they both live in LA. And so she reached out to me saying that, hey, John told me that you're a good writer. Like, would you like to maybe write for our blog? And my first impulse when I heard this was like, oh, there's probably so many more articulate and eloquent writers out there. You can like, I can give you names. And she's like, yeah, I already reached out to those people and they didn't want to do it. So no.
Sloppy seconds.
Yeah, no, but that's a complete joke. She really did want me, and I actually was I was quick to accept.
Okay, is this I will say the name of it so no one's embarrassed. Was it a douchebag from Glendale?
That's the post that went viral. And
tell us about it. I read it. It's very funny. It's very honest. It's very real because I live Glendale adjacent. So tell us what it was about.
It's kind of like what my experience was living in Virginia as an Armenian versus how my life changed once I moved to Glendale. And to give like kind of a synopsis of it, when I was in Virginia, especially as a young adult, and people would be like, oh, Misag, that's a very interesting, exotic name. Like, tell me a little bit more about your background. And I would say I was Armenian. And so I was associated with this like kind of mystery and intrigue, right? And then I moved to Glendale, and then people would ask me about my ethnicity, and I would say I was Armenian. I was associated with car insurance fraud, for example. And so there's like this expectation. There's this like idea, maybe even a stereotype about what it means to be an Armenian. There's this idea that you're just this very hairy, fat dude who smokes cigars and wears a lot of cologne and sells cell phones on the side of the street. Okay? And so I found that to be completely different from my experience growing up in Virginia, where the Armenians that I kind of was accustomed to, and there's very little, they were pretty well assimilated into Virginia.
Right.
So it was to my surprise that once I came to Glendale and I started meeting like regular people, like in downtown LA, I write about this in the story too, where I met this guy at this bar in downtown LA. And he didn't know that I was Armenian because I introduced myself as Mike, which is sometimes what I do when I'm talking to strangers. In that way, I don't have to really, go into depth about my family history.
Right.
And anyway, so he kind of, without me even pushing him, started saying something along the lines of, oh, like, where do you live? And I was like, oh, I live in Glendale. And he was like, careful, man. I was like, oh, like, what do you mean? And he's like, yeah, there's a lot of douchebags out there. and immediately I knew where this conversation was headed. And I was like, can you please elaborate? Like, what's going on? Like, what kind of douchebags? And he's like, yeah, man, like, there's a lot of Armenians. Armenians are everywhere in that area. I was like, oh, really? Like, I heard about that. Like, tell me more. And he's like, yeah, man, like, they're just milking the system because they pretend their kids are retarded and then they get extra money out of the government, and like this is 100% true. These are things that he's saying. It's like, it's very offensive, but I was not offended at all. I was just very curious and inquisitive, and I was like, I really wanted to understand what the perception of Armenian people are and how there's no control. I have no control over how this person feels. He literally met this one person or two people who kind of, in his mind, is what an Armenian is, and started spouting off on it. And so I think like the idea of that was that I bought him a drink, like a beer, and we clinked glasses. And the idea was that without knowing that I was a douchebag from Glendale, we became friends. And so we had this like very like platonic moment, when in fact he didn't really know that the person that he was clinking glasses with was the person who was
that's the sign of the writer. You were researching. You were doing your research, and you have the natural curiosity of a writer. And some stereotypes are based on some reality. Some young Armenian men are given fancy cars by their parents, and they drive too fast. And I think I've had the experience, I know you have, of almost being run down by them. And at the same time, I go into my bank there, and everybody there is Armenian, hardworking, law-abiding, good drivers. So we have to be careful. But I think that the way you do it it's humorous.
Well, my similar thing is, of course, I will be driving down the street and I will get really upset at people who are DWA as well, driving while Asian.
Yes,
and
because
so,
there's some truth to it.
Well, yes, because unfortunately, certain stereotypes ring very true.
Right.
And yes, there's a lot of Asians who drive 45 miles in a 60-mile-an-hour lane.
Yesterday, I drove. Somebody was driving me crazy. I finally passed them, and I look, and it was a little Asian lady. And well, there you go.
And I think this is a good place to talk about comedy and why we find stereotypes or these kind of like ethnic jokes so humorous. I do think that we need to be a little bit more, I think, mindful and like evolve from it, because at the same time, although they do have a spot in humor, they also are like, they're the easy joke. They're like they're maybe one step above like the fart joke, right? Yeah. Everyone's gonna laugh at it, but really can't you be a little bit more clever? Right. And so I try not to, engage too much in the stereotypes, because I do recognize that it is a simplistic form of thought.
Right.
But at the same time, it is funny, and
every once in a while it's confirmed.
Right.
The main thing is what do you do with it? Nobody's trying to harm anyone or get into a fight with anyone. Right. So when I see an Asian driver doing some of the, and Dan opened it up, doing something stereotypical, I laugh.
Right.
I laugh because I say, well, there we go, proving the stereotype. Yeah. For every excellent Asian, 100 Asian drivers, there's that one lady, driving.
No, there's the 99.
Yeah, there's 99. And Dan can say it because he's Japanese American.
But you know what's so fascinating about these stereotypes is that it's all based on a very limited experience about, you get into that one accident with that Asian person and suddenly Asian people are all bad drivers, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, to give you an example of, like, very, like, this is something that happened. I remember when I first moved out here to Glendale, opened up like an online dating profile, and I started going on a few dates. And one time I went out with this one, white girl, like classically white. And she asked me the same question. It's like, oh, like misak's very interesting. Like, tell me what that is. And so I said, yeah, I was Armenian. And the look this woman gave to me, like shocked. Her eyes bulged out, and she was like, and you know what she said to me?
What?
She said, but you don't look Armenian. But you know what's so strange about the tone and cadence of the way she said it was that I could tell she meant that as a compliment. And the reason why is because she probably dated some guy named Vartan in the past, okay? And like Vartan, probably they went on a date, and like, after the first date, as they were like walking back to their cars, he was like, so like, do you want to like come to my place, or do I come to yours, And like, and she had this negative experience. And then she realized that all Armenian dudes must be this like, very aggressive kind of,
Well, that's it's interesting because it's the unwillingness to look at a person as an individual, and that's when stereotyping for comedy based on some element of truth becomes prejudice,
right?
Becomes prejudicial and a closed mind. So I think what the humor does is actually keeps your mind open because you're aware that it isn't everybody, and you're not going to be doing anything like it's hurting anybody, with it. Let's get to your writing.
So yes, how does being a douchebag from Glendale fit in with your writing?
Well, to be clear, I'm not the douchebag from Glendale.
But as
we say that ironically.
I was saying that ironically.
Yes,
of course. But in terms of that persona, how are you using that in your writing? How are you using the fact you wrote that essay that had a lot of attention to it? How is that being used in your creativity?
Well, what was interesting about that experience of going viral for the first time, where literally I can't count how many people shared it, and then people actually started adding me for the first time, like people who I've never met before. It gave me this taste of when you don't have a voice growing up, you feel like you were silenced. And this is like where I can get to like Saran, where sometimes she'll tell me that I talk too loudly, and she'll tell me to modulate my voice. I have a theory about why that is. It's because when I was a child, I felt very silenced, right? And I didn't feel like I had a voice. I didn't feel like I was an anybody. And so part of the reason why maybe I talk loud, if you want to be very like psychological about it, and there's this unconscious side of me that says I want my voice to be heard. And so when Douchebag from Glendale came out, and I started seeing people responding to me and showing me respect, and there were some people who were critical too, but that also fed to this kind of ego that I have. That was the moment where I said, wow, this feels very powerful. I felt a sense of like, I reached out to these people, I entertained them, I made them think, and that was like a very validating experience for me, and something I had never really learned or experienced before.
You were seen and you were heard.
Right.
Now, in the scripts that you're writing right now, how many of them have Armenians as central characters?
Only one, and it was the first screenplay I ever wrote. And I think by default, your first screenplay is always a pedantic, self-indulgent kind of experience. And I think that's the only reason that an Armenian character was the central focus. And it was mainly because I was just writing a fictional version of myself, and about my experiences with love and loss, and this very juvenile, in my mind anyway, juvenile kind of pursuit. So I'm not very proud of the first script, but it was also very central for me to, or not central, but it was very important for me to like get all those feelings out there, and then also practice the craft of screenwriting.
I'll tell you something. I find that interesting because among the Asians I know who are writers, including me actually, we do not write about Asians. And I've noticed that many of the other Armenians in Armenian Rhapsody, which is our little group of Armenian entertainment industry people, most don't write Armenian skewing stories.
Right.
And is that because as immigrant culture that we're in some way or another embarrassed by it, or is it that we bought into the idea that maybe mainstream Hollywood won't accept it because it'll be considered too niche?
That's a great question, and I wish I had the answer for it, but I have a theory. And my theory is that we as writers working in Hollywood are always thinking about the target audience, just the way we do technical writing, right, where you always have that in mind. And so I think I learned this maybe even the hard way when I wrote that first script with the Armenian central character, and how very few people responded to it. They didn't essentially understand it or get it. I always used my excuse that, oh, this is art, it's only for a niche audience. But that's really just I was creating excuses for myself. Really, what it came down to was that I created a work that was for me and not for other people. And maybe I think part of, to answer your question, the reason why we focus as immigrants on other characters besides our own ethnicity is because we know what sells. We understand that if you write about 3 white men getting high, that has a higher chance of selling than, let's say, an Armenian who's like dealing with introspective problems.
You wrote something with 3 white men getting high, didn't you? I read something of yours. It's ringing a bell. Well, I think when you think about like My Big Fat Greek Wedding,
Sure.
it had a very relatable main character, the ugly duckling. The charming Prince Charming, and the family. Right? Everybody's got a family. Everybody, it was very specific and very universal, which is why it was one of the reasons why it was such a big hit. But it also had a lot of specific Greek elements, and people loved it.
That's
Because it was funny, it was touching, it had a good storyline, it was well written. So the thing about the Armenian thing is that it would be someone who happens to be Armenian with a particular issue or problem. What's the story? Surrounded by the culture, whatever that looks like. What's the family, and how does that influence him or her? So I think that especially with the Kardashian thing, even though they're half Armenian,
Right.
and when you watch that show, because I watched it years ago before it got really kind of skeevy, is that it really doesn't touch on Armenian culture at all. They are who they are. We don't have to get
Right.
into that, but I think that someone who happens to be Armenian has had the experience of growing up in an Armenian family and maybe some of the issues or whatever, because I know a lot of Armenian mothers were very overprotective, like a Greek father.
Right.
And, so the story of the son, I know you've shared some things with us about your mom, and I'm a mom and I understand her. It's like sometimes you just want your kids to live next door to you and never leave, know. So, but that's universal. And some mothers are better at handling that than others.
Absolutely.
So I would say if you want to any writer who has any ethnicity at all, you mine it for the details, for the culture, for how it influences your story. How does it
Right.
play in your story?
Absolutely.
As in My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which was a love story, basically, right? It was about a girl who changed her outlook, her look, and found love.
That's right. And what's interesting about My Big Fat Greek Wedding, that works so well as a model for, I think, any person who wants to pursue like a commercially viable like story that involves like a different ethnicity. And the reason why is because if you think about Tula as the main character, she is someone who's kind of stuck between those two, like the two worlds, right? So like this story, I don't think would have been half as relatable if it was told from the side of the mother or the father, right? So it's mainly because she is an interesting character where she's kind of, she's relatable to Americans because we know that that immigrant person who is struggling. And we kind of like, in high school we met that person and we kind of like left and we see ourselves and now we feel guilty when we watch that movie.
Right.
But then you also have like, the immigrant side of the family, whether you're Asian or Armenian or Jewish. And, if you're a first generation American, you also relate to that character.
Right.
So you're right. It's a universal story about first generation Americans.
Absolutely. And she's such you root for her. She's in other words, you look at her and you say, I could be friends with her because she's a warm and lovely person, trying to please her parents. And yet, she breaks out.
Right.
She breaks out at the same time. She breaks out, but there's a caveat. He has to become Greek Orthodox.
Exactly.
And so she marries this his character's kind of bland. He doesn't have much personality. He's more of a device.
Well, John Corbett kind of is that actor anyway.
Not always. He did a series about 10, 12 years ago called Lucky, about a gambler in Las Vegas. So when he also played Aiden on Sex and the City. It all depends on the writing for him. But that character was written very blandly. He's more of a device than anything. But that was the thing, was he had to come into their culture. She wasn't going to leave it entirely.
That's right.
And then they moved next door.
Let me ask you something, and I know we're going kind of far afield over here. Is my family, from my generation forward, we're a bunch of zebras. There is no one in my family who is attracted to other Asians. We're completely into every other ethnicity except other Asians, and I was wondering how that works in Armenian families. Is it that you have a pressure, because all of us were told you need to marry nice Japanese person, if not nice Japanese person, then you can marry nice Haole person. Only thing, no more marry Chinese. That was our big rule.
Oh, that was the thing. You couldn't marry a Chinese.
Oh no! It was like the worst thing you could do is marry an Asian who's not Japanese. It's like that's way worse than marrying any other ethnicity. And I'm sure that it was true for Chinese. If you tell a Chinese person, "Oh, you're going to marry a Japanese person," or in Jewish families, I mean, look at the Bridget Loves Bernie type situation where you've got. The Catholic and the Jewish person.
I was expected to marry a Jewish man, and my husband was half Jewish and half Irish, but his mother had converted before the wedding. He was the oldest, so he was, technically born Jewish, but he wasn't raised Jewish at all. But I was expected to marry a Jewish person, and my brother married a convert. She converted because she wanted to, and then their son married a convert also, who was in the process of converting when she met him. So everybody's Jewish, and it's this thing about having the same. Everybody has the same values. Everybody has the same religion. Everybody goes to the temple. Now you look at our culture, our country, and you see everything is exploding. Just watch Family Feud. The current, even 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you saw black families and all this interracial. These marriages, and now you see Japanese marrying Chinese, and it's no big deal.
Right.
And having
It still is.
For some people,
Japanese and Chinese, Korean, Chinese.
well, I can
all
imagine.
of
I
it.
wonder if that's from World War II, because what the Japanese did to the Chinese.
Probably,
Yeah.
but no, it was probably thousands of years ago.
It was like the Norwegians and the Swedes. The Norwegians for years. I don't know if it's still. They hate the Swedes because the Swedes stayed neutral during World War II, and the Norwegians didn't. So when I was in Scandinavia many years ago, there was this hatred of Sweden. But getting back to Dan's question, is there, like, for instance, when your parents look at you and say, well, we want you to get married, is there pressure for you to marry an Armenian girl? And is that do you see that a lot?
So I think that with my parents in particular, they made exceptions for us because we, of course, grew up in a town where there weren't that many Armenians. And so they kind of had the understanding that there might be a chance that maybe we won't be, introduced to an Armenian. So I think my parents were a little bit more open-minded about the possibility. But this is like, I hate to, bring this into into public domain, but they basically told me, I remember from a young age, if you do get married to someone who is an Armenian, make sure that person's white. Like, like any other ethnicity would have been kind of like a shame against the family.
I mean, if you were to marry a young black girl.
Right.
Yeah.
So there was there were
bit of
conditions.
prejudice, yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think that comes from a place where, where does it come from? I couldn't tell you, but I do know for a fact that there's this shame associated with marrying outside your culture. Even a white person, it would still be a little bit shameful. Like my sister, for example, did get married to an Italian, Irish, white man. And it took my parents a long time for them to finally get comfortable with the idea. And my sister's very happy, and, we all love my brother-in-law, everything's cool. But at the same time, there was that pressure. It's like, Rita, like, couldn't you find someone else within the thing?
It's about a comfort level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that people, when they do get married, they really have to, it's not just about love, it's about what are our values, is religion important? A lot of times people say, oh, it doesn't matter. Then they have children, and all of a sudden their
All of a sudden
religion,
it matters.
It matters.
Like, I'll give you
So
an
you have a
example.
better chance in a marriage, not saying that other marriages can't succeed.
cross-
If you
cross-
marry someone from your religion and your culture, if you're well matched, you have a better chance of being
Cross
successful.
ethnicity, I think, is much easier than cross religion.
Yeah.
Because
Right.
unless, of course, one of the people that you're cross religion is secular.
Yeah.
I think you can have someone who is strongly religious marry someone who is secular, but I don't think you can have someone who's strongly religious in one area marry someone who's strongly religious in another area.
Yeah, because then especially
Right.
once the kids come, so because then there's a tug of war.
Yeah.
Now, getting back to your writing, this is also interesting. We have so much to talk about, but let's get back to your writing. Okay, so you wrote your first screenplay, and it was whatever it was. You got something on paper. you got it out, and we know that you've been working on a pilot. That's true, right?
That's right.
Tell us about the process of writing the pilot and what you've learned about writing. Is it a comedy pilot or a drama?
It is. It's
half an hour, 1 hour?
It's a half an hour comedy pilot.
And you don't have to spill any secrets, but we're interested in your process and what you've learned.
Okay, sure. Well, I think TV is a much different beast than writing for feature films. And the reason why is because you're writing for something where you're introducing so much in such a short amount of time. You have to introduce all your main characters in the first 5 minutes. You have to see what the relationship is. You don't have enough room to really breathe and let a story kind of build. But that's okay in comedy, because I think sometimes in comedy, especially in TV, it comes from situations more than characters. But although characters also definitely define the comedy as well. In film, for example, I was able to spend a lot more time and get to know these characters and think about their past and how that reflects on them. Whereas in TV, I think it's a little different, because you're kind of focusing on what each episode will look like and how this all falls into the overarching narrative of that you're trying to convey. So there's differences, but
Now, I understand that you're working on more than one.
that's true.
So if you don't mind, can you give us some of the one-liners and some of who your associations are? How you don't have to name names, but how do you find being part of a writing partnership with different people?
Right. Well, I'm working on a number of projects right now. The one that I'm working on my own is called Like and Subscribe, which started off as a feature where it was completely different. But then when I turned it into a feature, I felt like I was exploring this new theme about what it means to be a celebrity, what it means to find fame in a very quick succession, which is something that I think writing A Douchebag from Glendale really contributed to. So, because I'll give you the 2-sentence pitch of what it is. It's the title of the show is called Like and Subscribe. And basically, it's about these 3 oddball misfit characters who are stuck in a dead-end marriage. They're stuck in a job that they don't like, and they will try.
How many people are married to each other?
Oh no, they're not. They're married to other people outside their job.
Got it.
Yeah, but they're kind of stuck in this kind of mundane reality, and so they think that, oh, what's the solution to our problems? What if we build an online following in order to bring meaning to our otherwise meaningless lives? And that's where the show kind of the first episode ends with basically one of the characters finding fame, but he's thrown into it by accident, where him and his coworker accidentally ingest crack cocaine without knowing it through a series of complicated events. And so then they get fired from their jobs and they start strangling each other on the streets of downtown LA. And one of the other characters, who's completely separate from them, as she's vlogging and passing by them, captures this and then turns it into a thug life video.
And this sounds like it's an exploration of what's going on in our culture today. Is not so much that you're famous because you have really achieved something serious or meaningful in any way,
right?
But you're famous because you're famous.
You're famous because
like the Kardashians,
right? And it's a very fleeting fame too, which is something that I want to explore as the series goes on. About once you find it, 2 days later you're a nobody again, and how it becomes like that drug where you constantly are looking for that next hit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you remember seeing all those articles about people who are trying desperately to be Instagram stars? And so they'll take thousands of pictures of themselves just to put up 5 or 6 selfies in the course of a day. And they absolutely live off of that.
It's sad, but that's exactly what I'm trying to capture with the show, is the kind of the comedy of it, but also the absurdity and the sadness, the inherent sadness of what it takes to be that kind of person who really is searching for that external validation from people that are complete strangers to you.
Did you ever see the Alfred Hitchcock Presents episode called The Gloating Place?
No.
It's a great episode, and it's more of a serious take on what I think you're trying to do.
Who's in it?
I don't remember the name of the actress, but it's about a girl who fakes that because she hasn't done her homework or something, she fakes that she's been assaulted. And so she becomes a heroine in the town because she survived this assault. And what ends up happening is she becomes more and more obsessed with keeping that attention wheel going to the point where she goes out there and she murders a classmate in order to keep the attention on her.
I remember this.
Yeah, and then at the end of the episode she ends up getting killed herself.
I remember
because
that.
now she sparked someone who also wants to get the attention. And since there's this murder going around now, it's a copycat. So it was actually directed by Hitchcock.
Wow. But you know what you mentioned? I remember that. It was very serious. And of course she had to be punished in the end. Um, but unlike the Bad Seed, wait, in the Bad Seed,
In the Bad Seed movie,
what happens in the end?
at the end,
Didn't
okay,
they punish her?
the movie goes out of control in the worst way in order to accommodate the censors. In the original play, The Bad Seed, you have this evil girl who goes around killing people, and at the end, her mother decides to kill the girl and herself, and she succeeds in killing herself, but the daughter survives. So it's a real creepy ending. Because that was such a taboo in 1956 Hollywood, they not only had to have her go outside in a thunderstorm and get struck dead by lightning. I mean, talk about really silly stuff. But then in the closing credits, you had the mother spank her.
I remember.
It was
I saw it recently.
it's like you're looking at that and you're like, want to rip your face off.
Yeah, because at that time Hollywood was very goody two shoes. God forbid this child should live to go on to murder. To push someone else down the stairs, right? The thing about that, I'm glad you mentioned the selfie culture, because I think that there's some kind of a film, a comedy or a dark comedy, because I know people who constantly post selfies, that their profile picture, their cover photo, and they never post anything of real value. It's always selfies. And people who go to the Grand Canyon and do the selfie with the Grand Canyon, because they have to insert themselves into every event, to natural wonders, that they can't just be witness to anything. They have to be part of everything. What's your theory about that, Dan?
The thing
And
that
I
really,
want to hear yours, too.
the thing that really was hilarious to me is that they actually have places where they forbid you from having a selfie stick. That's how bad it is. That kind of
Narcissism.
yes, of socially condoned narcissism has gotten so out of control. And part of it is because you had people make careers out of inappropriate videos.
And not only that, but it isn't like, let's take a selfie for our photo album. Let's take a selfie and just show it to the family. They put it on social media, making it seem as if I really want it. It's like when people put up pictures of their food on I've done it.
Right.
Like a Thanksgiving, I think I did with my turkey, but I don't do it all the time, because I'm eating. What do I care? Why do I want to see pictures of your food?
Right.
On the plus side, you've seen what's happened with Facebook. Facebook has actually gotten very desperate because all of the pushback against people excessively taking selfies. Like there was that one viral video that went out there of these group of girls watching like a sporting event, and all they're doing is taking selfies of themselves. And then you have all the food pictures. So now what's happened is a lot of people are afraid to post too many selfies or too many food pictures. And now Facebook is saying, we are having a hard time figuring out who people are to advertise to, because they're not putting up anything personal anymore.
Right. Anything personal or anything that they're interested in, or some, like on Facebook, to post something about politics, about a movie you saw, your opinions about the world, something that someone else said, a link to an interesting article. I mean, I think that to me, that's what to stay in touch with people, of course. But here's an interesting thing. There was a photo last year or months ago of in the Rembrandt Museum in Amsterdam, and there were like 8 little girls on a teenage
it wasn't
girls.
8 little girls. It was adults.
No. It was students. No, this was students, or they were adults. They were 18, whatever age they were. But they were all girls, and they're sitting on a bench, like in front of, the night masters or whatever the hell it was. Excuse my language. And they were all bent over on their phones, and it was awful. How could they? They're in a museum, and they're ignoring Rembrandt and blah, blah, blah. And it turns out that they had, before that happened, they had been standing there oohing and eyeing, listening to a lecture about it, asking questions. They were on an app that the museum puts on the phone for them to study, answer questions. So what they were doing was fine. But the thing is that a picture is worth 1,000 words of prejudgment, right? Somebody saw it and made an assumption, and it probably would be true in other aspects. But when I read that today, I went, investigation.
Right.
Let's have a little investigation. That this is a good use of a cell phone, a good use of an app. So What is your what is your experience and your theory about selfies and all of that?
Well, that's something that
Because you're in the key he's in the key demographic.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
And that's why I'm exploring the comedic angle of this in the show that I'm writing,
Right.
Like and Subscribe. And I think one way I explore it is the two characters. One is a little bit older, he's in his like mid 40s, and the other one is in his 30s. So like basically my voice versus someone who didn't grow up with social media. So what happens when you have two characters, one who grew up and knows nothing other than this world, and then someone who's kind of discovering it and trying to make sense of this new world, right? And so like actually I brought up my laptop just to give you a small sample of something that encapsulates the difference between these two generations, right? And so this is when both of the characters have gone to prison after being high and strangling each other in the middle of the street. And Larry, the main character, he's the one who's like the older character, and he kind of has this moment where he's kind of looking back at his life and thinking about where he went wrong. And he's very introspective, and he says something along the lines of, I just have to accept it. I was never destined to be a great writer or even a good writer. There's nothing interesting about me or my life. I'm 45 and I've never done anything to distinguish myself, and I doubt I ever will. I'll never be feted at fancy dinners or win awards. I'll never be remembered for my contributions or my stories. I'll just fade into obscurity, into the dark abyss of nothingness. This is my fate. This is my fate. And then Asim, the younger guy who's listening to this, he responds and he says, I feel you, man, but that's life. Not everyone gets what they want. Take my Instagram followers. You think they don't wish their lives could be more like mine? Of course they do. Who wouldn't want to eat a shit ton of fish tacos? And so like that's just the difference where someone's life can be defined by their social media presence. And
but also here's something I want to point out to you that I'm so happy you read that, because here you have Larry with his voice. He's kind of literate. He's introspective. He's obviously intelligent. He's depressed, but he's speaking in a very graceful kind of introspective way. And then you've got this guy with the hey man,
right.
and it's very funny. So what you've created are two characters, each with a different voice. And this is so important, especially in comedy. When you're writing a TV pilot, you have to have each character has to have their own voice in the best of TV. And everybody's heard this a million times from me. And this is what I tell the writers who are doing TV comedy: sit and watch the pilot for Cheers. To me, it's the best comedy pilot I've ever seen, because within 5 minutes you meet everybody. You know Diane's dilemma. You know everybody's attitude. You know who these people are, and the whole thing is set up when she doesn't get to marry her professor and she takes a job as a barmaid. And in like 22 minutes, they wrote a whole movie in essence. And every single character, Norm and Cliff, the two barflies, have very different. Everybody's got a different voice, a different attitude, and it's funny and it's really well written. And the relationships, and there were no jokes. You mentioned it before. All good comedy comes from character and situation.
Absolutely.
Right?
Right.
So I'm glad you read that, because I heard two very distinct different voices from two different generations.
Well, that's high praise. And that's really, I think, what you tried to set out to achieve. Because what I wanted to do is create a contrast, right? And in my opinion, all comedy stems from this idea, the formula, which is tragedy plus timing, right? And so I wanted to create some character who was dark, but I wanted to complement him with a character who was much lighter. And I feel like, if we, as my generation, is kind of the butt of many jokes, and for good reason, I wanted to create like the very absurd and kind of, the amplified version of what it means to be a millennial.
Right.
And the interaction you have with someone who's a little bit more grounded and who has goals and dreams and aspirations, but unfortunately for that character, it never really panned out. And the reason why was because he didn't really have this online world where he can get the fake validation that people in my generation, we were thirsty for.
Did you watch Parks and Recreation?
I did.
Because he reminds me a little bit of Tom. Aziz Ansari's character.
Asim, it's not a mistake that I named him Asim. I had Aziz in mind.
But Tom had depth to him too. But he had surprising depth. It's when those characters like that surprise you, because he wasn't a complete stereotype. He was very funny.
That's right.
But he was one of those people always thinking. He was always thinking, very, very, very creative. So is this pilot, the thing about TV is that characters can't really change. Like in a film, a character can have a character development and be changed and have grown and realized things. In TV comedy, you're kind of recycling their stuff.
This is the challenge of TV
Yeah.
because especially when you have a show that's a hit and it's going to go on beyond 5 years, now you're starting to move into a show that has to work over multiple generations, a generation being defined as a 7-year audience cycle. And so when you have a show that starts to cross that, at that point you're going to start alienating your original viewers because it's got to change because people in real life get mature. One of the problems I had with Sex and the City, in fact, was the fact that by the time that show ended, you're looking at these women going, you kind of are getting pathetic.
That's right.
Because you're getting really old.
I have to disagree about Sex and the City. There was a lot of growth for all of them. I watched every single episode. The last few seasons were amazing. The
I'm
redhead.
talking about going to Arabia.
Oh, you're talking about the movie?
I'm talking about when you get all the way to the end from the very beginning.
Oh, you're talking about the movie. I'm talking about
Yeah.
the series because the series, they did go through a lot of growth and change from the very beginning.
I feel like the films were more or less just like a fan
the
service.
films were well. The first one was when she married Mr. Big. It was silly.
Yes.
The second one was ridiculous, and Entourage, which was I love Entourage. That movie was so bad.
Yeah.
So it's almost like for me, Godfather 3 doesn't exist.
Right.
I will focus on what really worked for me. But you're right. Oh, the movie. Oh, the
Because
movie
it's
was dreadful.
So, but and it didn't.
What
show
they did,
any growth.
they had growth by the final episode of the series. Each one of them. It was very moving and very, very powerful. Do you remember
I do.
Miranda and her mother-in-law
Yes.
who had Alzheimer's, and Charlotte finding love with a bald, hairy Jewish guy and they get the thing that they're getting a Chinese baby, and the Samantha admits she has strong feelings for this young man, and Big and Carrie finally get together. They finally get real, and then in the movie, it's all forgotten.
I think what we're touching on here is that there has been a revolution in the way we tell stories in TV. In the sense that, like, if you think about your classic sitcom like Seinfeld, those characters, you can create a million of those kind of episodes and those characters never change and they don't have to, right?
Because they're single and they don't have kids.
Right. But then when you look at like the new model of TV and when we think of like Sex and the City or we think of Entourage or we think of like Silicon Valley, which I'm modeling Like and Subscribe based on like current shows like Silicon Valley, you have characters who are actually growing, in fact, and they're changing, and it's very movie-like in the sense that big things do happen and their worlds do shatter and they change. Now, like, they're in the context of like the tech bubble, for example, but like things happen where he's not the CEO of his company anymore. That's a big story event that you would think would only happen in a movie, and then you would explore what the consequences of that in the movie. But in TV, you can do that in a series of episodes. Breaking Bad, I think, changed a lot, where that more or less, it's not a TV show in the traditional sense. It's a 5-series long movie,
Yeah, absolutely. It's about the descent into. Well, I think it's Shakespearean. It's the
It is.
descent into hell of a good man.
Right.
That's basically a little bit like Godfather. The trajectory of Michael Corleone in the two Godfather movies.
And so, like, sometimes when I get the criticism with Like and Subscribe, and it's not really criticism, it's more like, this feels more like the first act of a movie. I don't consider it that as like, that I should go and write a feature-length film. I mean, I could, and I'd be happy to do it because I have a story that I could tell, but I'd rather tell this in a series because these characters mean a lot to me, and I know what their backstories are, and I want to explore
you
that.
could also do, I don't want to say a limited series.
Sure.
You could do 10 episodes a season. You have to know where you're going to go with these with the characters. I like for me, listening to this, I like the idea of a feature film because I want to see the stakes get raised. What happens after they lose their fame? What are the desperate things they're going to do to become
But wouldn't
famous?
you
It's
like
very
the-
networky.
Yeah.
It's like movie network in,
Yeah.
in a way because it's at once funny, but it's also a nice sharp commentary on culture
Yes,
and how it wrecks relationships.
Write
What's
it any
the-
way you want because
Yeah.
you have two people here who will take a look and give you feedback.
And
And the thing is,
I'm
we can
always thankful
always change our mind. We can always say, yes, I've written 4 episodes and I think it is a feature or it's going to work. The only thing to do is tell everybody out there, whoever's listening, keep writing.
That's true.
Just keep writing. That's the best thing to do is just to keep writing. And
Yeah.
you've got, and we have talked about another project that I've encouraged you to write. You may not be ready to, based on your own personal experience growing up in Virginia during a very difficult time for the country. But advocating for other people's creativity, is part of our creativity. Dan's and mine as encouragers and mentors, and plus, we both write. Dan has a script that we worked on. You were my PA
Yes.
in the craft service department, and Dan did a short film. The whole tribe worked on it with him, and he's also written another script that I so want to work on with him. That's so wonderful that you wrote years ago. Yes, and I have my own writing that I sometimes neglect because I'm so busy, working with other people. So I find having a guest like you so inspiring, at least for me, with my own creative juices for my own projects.
And thank you. And the mentorship that you guys have also offered has, I think, contributed to where I am right now, because I don't think 2 years ago I was the same writer that I am today. I think part of it was like, you guys have given me a lot of guidance. You've taken the time to read it. And you, Saran, you were the first person to read my script, and you gave me a lot of critical feedback about why this wasn't working for you. You stopped reading at page 30. This
You mean
was
that
the feature.
first script about the fantasy girl?
Yeah. Like even the one Ready to Retire, which was what Like and
that
Subscribe
one. Yes.
turned into. Anyway, point being is that you weren't afraid to tell me that I just got bored after this point, and that was very useful for me to hear and say that, well, if this is boring, then I need to, instead of giving up.
But what's good about what you just said is you're not looking for accolades. Of course, we all have egos, and of course, we want everybody to love what we write. But to be able to get past that, because everybody. Who wants to rewrite a script? It should be perfect the first time. But to get past it and be able to hear people.
I'll tell you, this is why I think Misak has great potential,
Yes.
because I've had a couple of students who are geniuses at writing, and they refuse to do a second draft. So no matter how good their stuff is, it will never go to where it should go, and their careers will not go because they're not willing to do the hard work.
Yeah, because writing is rewriting.
It is.
Hemingway said, and I won't use the word he said, but he said the first draft of anything is crap. Now, it's an exaggeration, but what he meant was you have to go back and make it better and better, and also to be able to accept the feedback from other people. And of course, you have to show it to the right people. And don't. And I tell people, when you have finished your first draft, you put it in a drawer and you don't look at it for a month, at least a month. Because then it becomes fresh, and don't talk about it, and don't show it to too many people. You pick the people you show it to, because some people have agendas.
And there's an element of masochism that also goes into it, where you, and I know this is also, I sometimes thinking about like the underlying psychological like reasons for things, but I think that there's a certain truth to the idea, with me specifically, that I'm the harshest critic of myself in a way. And so when I hear other people criticize me as a person or my work, I don't internalize it, but I do take it into consideration very seriously. And so I start becoming very reflective.
That openness will serve you in Hollywood, because you'll be able to go to meetings and not get defensive. You'll be able to make the adjustment when somebody gives you notes on a script. You won't argue with them. I was at a pitch thing yesterday where we were giving feedback to a film production student on his pitch, and he kept defending himself. Because he was telling us every single scene and giving directorial things. We just wanted to hear the story. And he defended himself till the end, whereas someone else was going, okay, thank you, I'll fix that, or let me start over, So the openness to hearing what other people have to say, especially people who have some authority or power over you, like to give you money, but then you draw the line between...
That is, by the way, also the key, is that where I sometimes have a challenge when you see writing in the classroom is that you have students being the most vicious critics toward other students, and they don't have the credibility.
No,
other than being looking at it like an English teacher.
Yeah, and when he used the word vicious, there's honesty that comes from a genuine interest in helping to make it better.
Right.
Because I think the work that I've done as a development person and the work that I do with Dan and with students of all kinds while I'm very proud of my abilities and all that, it's very selfless work, because you're devoted to the cause of the project. You want to help them make it better. So you have to talk to the right people and show it to the right people. Brutal honesty that's advocating for the writer and the project is very different from vicious criticism that serves the
That's right.
criticizer, the critic. Yes. So we're very, you've been a terrific guest. We hope
thank
that
you.
you can come back and talk to us more about you have a new job doing a little bit of technical writing and some other things where
Well, and also working on a new pilot that has promise. We're working with a producer who has ties to NBC and Netflix. So me and Armin are involved in this project. So we'll have to maybe after we'll talk about it.
oh, that will be so exciting to hear, the young Turks or the young
Yeah.
Armenians in Hollywood.
Right.
Yes.
So please come back.
Thank
It
you.
would
I
be
will. I
terrific.
had a great time. Thank you guys for all of your wonderful questions. I want to come back and start asking you guys questions because I think you guys have a lot to offer too.
Yes, but we loved having you, and please come back.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
this is Saran Fox.
And Dan Watanabe.
This was Dan and Saran Take on Hollywood, signing off.